First, let's start with one of the most basic ideas Lacan offered, namely the temporality that comes solely from language, something that everyone, Lacanians and non-Lacanians alike, can understand. This is the way that for the unit of language, the sentence, nobody ever knows exactly what the beginning of the sentence is going to mean until the end of the sentence arrives. At this point, meaning has to work retroactively. It must return to the beginning and do a bit of infill. It not only completes what the beginning had to leave incomplete, it suggests why and how the beginning began, where it came from, what motivated it, what preceded it. In psychoanalysis, this retroaction of the symbolic chain plays many roles. In analysis, it is the après coup. In compulsive repetition, it is Freud's Nachträglichkeit. And in more general literary terms, it is the requirement that the ending of a work answer to the beginning, however these are conceived. Dan Collins has argued that this principle, what Roland Barthes christened as the récit fort, or strong narrative, is present in every story. I would say it's present even in less clearly temporal works of art, architecture, and especially photography. Art engages the logic of the circle, the circuit, the round trip. In this process, we get the whole truth and nothing but the truth, the function that Michel Foucault called parrhesia, full access to the truth. More about that later. Angie, Francesco, and I are all interested in architecture and in Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Here we have Lacan's direct references to architecture. He specifically identifies the function of the void and enclosure of the void, which is a kind of impossible object, pointing to the Zizek'ian theme of incontinence or leakage, which is quite important. In Seminar 7, we find the striking story of Daphne and Apollo, which Lacan tells in reference to the clearly projective space in which Daphne, trying to flee from Apollo's advances, finds no way out. This idea of a surface from which there is no escape is directly connected to architecture as a surface of pain by Lacan, a quite interesting reference we'd like to pursue under several headings. Here is the passage that sounds so negative to most architectural fans of Lacan that there seems to be no hope of salvaging its clues. However, for anyone interested in projective geometry, which is precisely about spaces from which there is no possibility of escape, there is a solid gold reference. Lacan is not characterizing architecture in any way. He is referring it to a certain spatial logic that is not just non-Euclidean, it is anti-Euclidean, or even anamorphic, especially in that he uses the story of Daphne's transformation into a tree to say what can be done when there is no way to hop out of one space into some other. There isn't any way to introduce projective geometry as a topic at this time. Let me say only that projective geometry is mathematically prior to Euclid, and my question has been, for the past few months, whether there is a historical priority as well. Is there something that came before Euclid, but was not recognized as projective geometry? I think Lacan himself gives the answer, here in a micro way, but later in Seminar 7 in his references to anamorphosis. In fact, he poses exactly the same paradox. If anamorphosis appears suddenly in its literal form in the architecture and art of the 16th century, doesn't this mean that there must have been something that came before that was not called anamorphosis, but which had the same function? Anamorphosis didn't just happen ex nihilo. It had to be something before Holbein painted his famous double portrait of the ambassadors in 1533. I think Cassirer has the answer, and I think his idea of how the uncanny structures the form of mythic thinking shows ways to develop this idea. I'll show this famous painting just briefly. John North has put forward the thesis that the anamorphic skull constructs another set of projective lines connecting the crucifix, the skull's viewing point, the important offsets in the navigation instruments, and the date of the painting, April 11th, 1533, thought to be the time of the apocalypse. There is truly no escape from this, but there is the theme of temporality in the spatial rebus or cryptogram. It's necessary to get back to the story of Daphne and Apollo, because there is the same idea of folding time back on itself, the core of Lacan's thinking about how signifiers structure their own apocalypse.